For over a century, Aleister Crowley has been remembered as one of the most controversial figures of modern history. Known to the public as the self-proclaimed Great Beast 666, a poet, mountaineer, and magician, he was vilified in newspapers, branded as the wickedest man alive, and dismissed by society as a heretic and social deviant. Crowley's flamboyant lifestyle, his fascination with the occult, and his rebellious defiance of moral conventions made him a household name for scandal and fear. However, recent discoveries in intelligence archives, wartime records, and personal correspondences have challenged this familiar narrative, suggesting that Crowley may not have been the chaotic villain history portrayed. Instead, he could have been a meticulously crafted figure operating with purpose, cunning, and strategy. Historians analyzing newly declassified documents now propose that Crowley's infamous public persona might have served as camouflage, hiding a secret role as an intelligence operative working on behalf of British interests during World War I and beyond. These revelations paint a picture of a man whose life was not only controversial but carefully orchestrated, combining performance, deception, and psychological insight to manipulate public perception while working under the guise of a deranged occultist. This dual identity, Crowley the public figure and Crowley the operative or operative AC, as some documents refer to him, presents a radical rethinking of his legacy, challenging the simplistic view of him as merely a scandalous mystic that Crowley's public myth as the Great Beast and his supposed madness were well established by the time he arrived in New York in 1914 at the height of World War I. To the general public, he appeared as an eccentric expatriate writing for The International, a pro-German publication that promoted anti-British sentiment. His articles were extreme, inflammatory, and so outrageous that even German sympathizers reportedly found them suspicious. However, historian Richard Spence's careful examination of British, American, and Italian archives suggests that Crowley's writings were part of a deliberate effort to discredit Germany in the United States. By producing the most extreme and morally shocking propaganda possible, Crowley effectively turned public opinion against Germany, helping to weaken its image without anyone suspecting British involvement. In this interpretation, Crowley's flamboyant public persona was not a sign of madness, but a carefully engineered mask, a performance designed to make him the last person anyone would suspect of working for British intelligence. During this period, he moved among nationalists, diplomats, revolutionaries, and foreign agents, gathering intelligence while maintaining the appearance of an eccentric, heretical figure. Even acts like justifying the sinking of the RMS Lusitania or promoting aggressive rhetoric in the press, once seen as treasonous or fanatical, now appeared to have been strategic, self-sabotaging acts intended to undermine Germany's credibility. Crowley's infamy became both shield and weapon, allowing him to operate with a freedom unavailable to conventional spies. His life during these years demonstrates how carefully orchestrated perception can alter public understanding and influence international affairs. That Crowley's journey toward this dual identity did not begin with adulthood or a sudden appearance on the world stage. It started in childhood. Born Edward Alexander Crowley in 1875 in Leamington Spa, England, he grew up in a strict religious household, the son of a traveling preacher associated with the Plymouth Brethren. His early life was defined by rigid obedience, constant moral discipline, and expectation of purity, reinforced by the family's wealth and social standing. Every meal began with prayer. Every day ended with scriptural readings, and his father's death in 1887 shattered the foundation of his upbringing. In response to these strictures and the inconsistencies Crowley perceived within the faith, he began to resist and explore his own ideas of belief and authority. His mother, unable to control his rebellious impulses, labeled him the beast, a biblical insult intended to shame him into obedience. Yet Crowley embraced the label, transforming condemnation into identity and beginning a lifelong practice of self-reinvention. This early experience of shaping perception and adopting alternative personas foreshadowed his later ability to manipulate public opinion, construct hidden networks, and operate as a covert agent under the guise of a notorious magician. The psychological patterns developed during childhood, learning to adopt multiple identities, testing belief systems, and experimenting with influence, became the foundation for the adult figure historians now associate with espionage, strategic misdirection, and psychological warfare. As Crowley moved into adulthood, The name change from Edward Alexander to Aleister Crowley symbolized the completion of this transformation. The new identity allowed him to separate the boy shaped by religious discipline from the man who would navigate political, social, and literary circles with complete theatrical freedom. This persona was carefully crafted for memorability and impact, allowing Crowley to engage with multiple spheres, literary, occult, and political, while obscuring the true nature of his activities. Archives reveal that Crowley's unusual behavior, his extreme writings, and his occult practices were more than eccentricity. They were tools for shaping perception. By appearing as a scandalous, untrustworthy figure, Crowley gained access to spaces and information unavailable to traditional operatives. His notoriety provided plausible deniability and created a strategic advantage, as few suspected that the man they feared and ridiculed might actually be collecting intelligence and influencing public opinion on behalf of state interests. Crowley's work in New York and later in Spain and Italy demonstrates how deeply he embedded himself in the early structures of intelligence operations. The International magazine, run by Irish nationalist George Sylvester Varick, became a platform for Crowley to present himself as a German sympathizer while covertly advancing British propaganda objectives. Through coded correspondence, carefully orchestrated public scandals, and controlled exaggeration in his articles, he eroded Germany's reputation while simultaneously hiding in plain sight. Historians note that Crowley's writings and public behavior align with tactics later formalized in psychological operations, suggesting that his seemingly erratic conduct was a deliberate exercise in shaping belief, behavior, and perception. The rituals and occult ceremonies that attracted ridicule may have been experiments in social influence and compliance, observing how symbolic acts could manipulate expectations and prompt predictable reactions. In essence, Crowley's public persona was a complex experiment in perception management, a precursor to modern psychological warfare, conducted decades before formal programs existed. Crowley's intelligence activities extended beyond propaganda and public influence. He moved effortlessly among diplomats, revolutionaries, and radical political actors in Europe, cultivating relationships and gathering intelligence under protection of his public infamy. His contact network spanned multiple countries, connecting him indirectly to influential figures, including those associated with British intelligence strategy, such as Maxwell Knight, whose methods would later inspire the fictional M in James Bond. These connections illustrate that Crowley was not merely drifting through occult and political worlds. He was actively participating, learning, and shaping the very currents of influence he inhabited. The Great Beast identity, once assumed to be an emblem of moral chaos, functioned as a strategic instrument, allowing him access, observation, and influence that conventional agents could not achieve. Perhaps the most intriguing episodes involve Crowley's indirect connections to high-level Nazi figures, including Rudolf Hess. Hess's fascination with astrology and esoteric symbolism made him a potential target for psychological influence, and Crowley reportedly offered his expertise to British authorities in deciphering Hess's motivations. While the extent to which this advice was implemented remains debated, it highlights how Crowley's dual identity and knowledge of occult and symbolic systems intersected with strategic intelligence considerations. His role in influencing individuals and networks demonstrates the subtle, psychological dimension of his work, the manipulation of belief, expectation, and perception in a real-world context of international politics and warfare. Despite the emerging evidence of Crowley's intelligence work, the official record of his contributions largely disappeared following his death in 1947. MI5 and MI6 both claimed that no records existed, and many files that could confirm or refute his activities were reportedly destroyed without explanation. This erasure mirrors the carefully constructed persona Crowley maintained during his life, layers of concealment, misdirection, and plausible deniability. Historians argue that his absence from official archives was not accidental, but a continuation of the strategy that had defined his existence, maintaining operational freedom under the guise of scandal. The fragments that remain, references in military correspondence, surviving diaries, and mentions in diplomatic papers, reveal a consistent pattern of deliberate manipulation, showing that Crowley's public image and hidden work were inseparable components of the same strategy. Ultimately, Aleister Crowley's legacy cannot be understood merely through the lens of occultism, scandal, or moral transgression. The newly examined evidence reframes his life as a deliberate, calculated engagement with the mechanics of perception, propaganda, and psychological influence. His public persona, far from being a distraction from his intelligence work, was central to it, providing cover and access while enabling experimentation with social behavior. Crowley's life demonstrates a profound interplay between myth, statecraft, and perception management, illustrating how a carefully constructed identity can manipulate public belief and influence entire societies. Historians now recognize Crowley as a figure whose life bridged the worlds of scandal, occultism, and covert operations, serving as an early example of psychological warfare and demonstrating the power of persona as an instrument of statecraft. Aleister Crowley's story is a reminder that history often hides as much as it reveals. Behind the notorious image of the Great Beast lies a carefully orchestrated life of strategic misdirection, intelligence gathering, and psychological experimentation. Crowley's dual identity, the public magician and the hidden operative, forces a reevaluation of how perception, identity, and narrative can be manipulated to serve larger political objectives. His legacy endures not only as a figure of scandal, but also as a blueprint for the intersection of myth, media, and state power. By examining Crowley's life in this light, historians uncover lessons about the subtle influence of perception, the strategic value of notoriety, and profound ways in which individuals can shape history while hiding in plain sight. For over a century, Aleister Crowley has fascinated the world. Known as the Great B666, he was vilified in newspapers, branded as the wickedest man alive, and remembered as a scandalous poet, mountaineer, and magician. His life appeared to be a continuous chain of rebellion, eccentricity, and moral defiance. Crowley's flamboyant lifestyle, obsession with the occult, and theatrical behavior made him a figure of fear and fascination. But what if the story we've been told isn't the whole truth? Recent discoveries in declassified intelligence archives and wartime records suggest that Crowley may have been much more than a chaotic villain. Historians have uncovered documents indicating he may have lived a double life as a covert operative, known in some files as Operative AC. These revelations challenge everything we thought we knew about him, suggesting his public persona might have been carefully engineered to conceal intelligence work for the British government during World War I. That Crowley's early reputation as a heretic and social deviant might have been a deliberate disguise. The extreme and outrageous actions that horrified the public may have been calculated to hide his real activities. By creating the persona of the Great Beast, Crowley ensured that no one would suspect him of playing a role in international espionage. His flamboyant persona became both a shield and a weapon, allowing him to operate in spaces and circles that would have been inaccessible to ordinary agents. But how did a boy from a strict religious family in England become this controversial figure? And what led him to develop the skills necessary to deceive entire nations? In the next episode, we'll explore Aleister Crowley's childhood and the early experiences that shaped the man who would later manipulate perception, identity, and history itself. Aleister Crowley was not always the Great Beast. Born Edward Alexander Crowley in 1875 in Leamington Spa, England, he grew up in a household governed by strict religious rules. His father, a traveling preacher, imposed a rigid routine of prayer, obedience, and moral discipline. Every day followed the same schedule, and the young Edward was expected to live a life of purity and adherence to faith. But life changed dramatically when his father died in 1887. The structure that had defined Edward's existence collapsed, exposing contradictions in the strict doctrines he had been taught. His mother attempted to maintain control, labeling him the beast as a way to shame him into obedience. Instead, Edward embraced the name, turning condemnation into identity. This moment marked the beginning of a pattern that would define his life. Self-reinvention through perception and belief as he grew older, Crowley rejected inherited dogma and replaced it with self-directed exploration. He began experimenting with identity, learning how to influence how others perceived him. The skills he developed, adopting multiple personas, observing reactions, and shaping behavior, would later serve as a foundation for his intelligence activities. When Edward Alexander became Aleister Crowley, he completed the transformation. The new name was theatrical, memorable, and functional, enabling him to interact with literary, social, and political spheres without revealing his true purpose. Crowley's childhood experiences also taught him the power of symbols, ritual, and belief. The religious practices he had been raised with became tools he could repurpose, not for faith, but for influence. By the time he arrived in New York in 1914, the skills he had honed over decades, observation, experimentation, and strategic deception, were fully developed. The great beast was no longer just a rebellious figure. He was a master of perception, ready to test his abilities on the world stage. In 1914, Aleister Crowley arrived in New York at a time when the city was a hotbed of international intrigue. German agents, Irish nationalists, American isolationists, and British loyalists were all vying to shape public opinion about the war in Europe. To the public, Crowley appeared as a flamboyant, eccentric expatriate, writing for the International, a pro-German publication. His articles were extreme, inflammatory, and designed to provoke outrage. But historians now argue that these outrageous writings were anything but reckless. According to British intelligence files recently examined, Crowley's extreme pro-German stance was a calculated act of self-sabotage designed to discredit Germany in the eyes of the American public. Even German sympathizers reportedly found his arguments so over the top that they became counterproductive. By exaggerating Germany's positions and promoting extreme rhetoric, Crowley helped turn opinion against Germany. Without anyone realizing he was working for the British, Crowley's public persona as the Great Beast became the perfect disguise. The more outrageous he appeared, the less anyone suspected that he was actively participating in espionage. Behind the headlines, coded correspondences, and movements across New York aligned with British intelligence objectives. He interacted with diplomats, revolutionaries, and radicals, all while maintaining the appearance of moral decay and personal chaos. His scandalous reputation provided him with operational freedom, making him one of the most unusual and effective agents of his time. The lesson of Crowley's early work in New York is clear. Perception is power. By controlling how the world saw him, he could operate invisibly, influencing events and shaping opinion from the shadows. The question remains, how far did Crowley's influence reach beyond the city streets of New York? In the next episode, we will follow his movements to Europe, where his covert activities took him to Spain and Italy, and uncover the extent of his network of intrigue. After his controversial stint in New York, Aleister Crowley returned to Europe, where the stakes were higher, the players more dangerous, and the intelligence networks far more complex. Spain and Italy during World War I were filled with political radicals, German agents, Irish nationalists, and secret networks all vying to manipulate the shifting loyalties of nations. To most, Crowley appeared the same flamboyant occultist, obsessed with rituals, symbols, and the mystical. His behavior seemed erratic, theatrical, and morally questionable. But historians examining recently declassified files now argue that his madness was a carefully maintained mask in Spain. Crowley embedded himself among circles of diplomats, radicals, and spies. His so-called mystical gatherings, complete with candles, chants, and elaborate ceremonies, were in reality controlled psychological experiments. He studied reactions, measured obedience, and observed how belief shaped behavior. Historians argue that these gatherings were early forms of psychological operations, decades before such programs became formalized by intelligence agencies. The rituals provided a perfect cover for gathering sensitive information. No outsider suspected that beneath the mysticism, strategic observation, and intelligence collection were happening in Italy. Crowley continued to build his network, moving among nationalists, political operatives, and influential figures in secretive societies. His flamboyant persona gave him access where normal agents would have been denied. Letters and diaries from this period, now examined in detail, reveal coded notations about individuals, events, and contacts. While his public image as a decadent, dangerous figure drew attention away from his real work, historians see a pattern. Crowley was operating with precision. Every scandal, every act of theatricality, reinforced the illusion of chaos, masking a carefully orchestrated intelligence agenda. Crowley's European operations also hint at his growing influence in shaping political narratives. His manipulation of perception went beyond simple espionage. By studying human behavior and belief systems, he was learning how to influence decisions, sow confusion, and guide outcomes without ever issuing direct orders. The Great Beast persona, which had started as personal rebellion, had evolved into a tool of statecraft. As Crowley moved through Europe, he intersected with figures who would later play pivotal roles in intelligence. The connections he built, The behaviors he observed and the influence he exerted became part of a hidden architecture of early modern espionage. The line between mystical theatrics and strategic manipulation blurred, leaving historians to reconsider his life not as a series of chaotic adventures, but as a deliberate design of a covert operative in action. The story of Aleister Crowley's life takes a darker and more complex turn with the emergence of his connection to Rudolf Hess, Deputy Führer of Nazi Germany. Hess was deeply fascinated with astrology, mysticism, and esoteric prophecy, making him unusually receptive to symbolic manipulation. Historians reviewing wartime intelligence files now suggest that Crowley's expertise in belief, ritual, and perception could have made him a valuable asset in monitoring and influencing figures like Hess. During the early 1940s, when Hess undertook his famous solo flight to Scotland on a secret peace mission, British intelligence scrambled to understand what had motivated him. In archival records, there's evidence that Crowley was considered as a consultant to interpret Hess's motivations, based on his interest in occult ideas. Crowley himself offered assistance, claiming that he could decode Hess's astrological and mystical decisions. Whether British intelligence formally used him remains uncertain, but the very fact that they reached out illustrates the extraordinary proximity of Crowley's influence to critical wartime events. That Crowley's reputation as the Great Beast was no accident. It became a tool of operational security. The theatrics that seemed absurd to the outside world allowed him to operate in sensitive circles unnoticed. Meetings that appeared to be mystical experiments were in fact psychological testing grounds. Crowley studied how symbols, rituals, and even gestures could shape perception and behavior, methods that would later be formally studied as psychological operations. His dual identity, the public madman and the hidden operative, allowed him to navigate spaces where conventional agents could not. Historians examining Crowley's network note that his activities were not isolated eccentricities. They formed a structured, deliberate pattern of observation and influence, spanning decades and continents. From intelligence gathering in Spain and Italy to indirect involvement in wartime operations during World War II, Crowley's work prefigured modern psychological warfare. The Great Beast was more than an eccentric occultist. He was a master of perception, influence, and controlled misinformation. This revelation forces a reassessment of Crowley's role in history. The caricature of the deranged magician dissolves, revealing instead a figure whose study of belief, ritual, and symbolism allowed him to manipulate human behavior for strategic purposes. Crowley's life becomes a blueprint for understanding how psychological operations and propaganda could operate under the guise of spectacle and myth. When Aleister Crowley died in 1947, the story of his life did not end. It began to vanish. Historians have discovered that key intelligence files, which had confirmed his role as a British operative, were deliberately destroyed. MI5 and MI6 both claimed that no records existed, yet American archives contain fragmented references to Crowley's wartime collaboration. The precision and thoroughness of the disappearance suggest a deliberate erasure rather than simple oversight. Why would an intelligence service erase the record of its most unconventional agent? Historians argue that admitting the British Empire had employed its most notorious heretic, drug user, and social outcast would have been politically catastrophic. Crowley's public image, a scandalous, morally corrupt figure, was precisely what allowed him to operate freely, and acknowledging his loyalty risked revealing sensitive wartime operations. His legend became a shield, his infamy a strategic asset. The surviving fragments reveal a man who understood perception as power. His rituals, writings, and public persona were tools to influence belief and behavior, effectively shaping public opinion, while remaining publicly denounced. Crowley's life demonstrates the overlap between mythology and statecraft, spectacle and strategy. Analysts now argue that beneath his poetic chaos lay structures for behavioral influence and psychological experimentation that prefigured modern intelligence techniques. That Crowley's legacy forces historians to reconsider the boundaries between myth and reality, chaos and control. The Great Beast persona was not an accident of life. It was a deliberate operational design, a precursor to psychological operations that would later formalize in intelligence services. By manipulating perception and embracing scandal, Crowley created the ultimate cover for covert activity, leaving a blueprint for how culture, belief, and narrative can be weaponized. Today, Aleister Crowley is remembered not only as the world's most notorious occultist, but also as an early architect of psychological influence. His life shows how myth can be engineered, how chaos can conceal order, and how one man's dual identity changed the way governments manipulate information. The true legacy of the Great Beast is no longer magic. It is power, perception, and control. Aleister Crowley's genius lay not in magic, poetry, or scandal alone, but in his mastery of duality. From childhood, he learned to live two lives. The obedient Edward Alexander, shaped by strict religious upbringing, and the rebellious Aleister Crowley, the flamboyant magician, poet, and provocateur. This duality allowed him to manipulate public perception while conducting covert operations. Historians now suggest that every scandal, ritual, and outrageous statement served a purpose beyond personal indulgence. To be why maintaining persona of the Great Beast, Crowley became invisible to scrutiny. Governments, radicals, journalists, and social circles all saw what they expected: a decadent, erratic, and morally corrupt individual. No one suspected that beneath this public performance, Crowley was strategically gathering intelligence, analyzing human behavior, and influencing events to support British wartime objectives. His public persona acted as camouflage, allowing him to navigate spaces that were off-limits to traditional operatives. Crowley's writings, once dismissed as chaotic or heretical, were carefully calculated. His exaggerated pro-German propaganda in New York, for example, aimed to discredit Germany by making its policies appear absurd and cruel. The outrage he provoked in the press wasn't a side effect. It was a feature of the operation. By exaggerating German policies, Crowley manipulated public sentiment and created plausible deniability for British intelligence. The theatrics of the Great Beast persona were the perfect cover for strategic deception. Across Europe, Crowley employed similar tactics. In Spain and Italy, his mystical rituals allowed him to interact with diplomats, radicals, and secret societies without raising suspicion. His studies of psychological responses, how individuals reacted to symbols, language, and ritual, were groundbreaking for time. Observers assumed he was conducting esoteric experiments. Historians now see these as early forms of psychological operations. Crowley's dual identity wasn't just a personal experiment. It was a tool that enabled him to operate effectively within intelligence networks while remaining publicly untouchable. This mastery of duality also gave Crowley access to individuals and environments that traditional agents couldn't reach. By appearing unpredictable, theatrical, and morally ambiguous, he created a space where others underestimated him. Diplomats confided in him, radicals welcomed him, and enemies ignored him. All the while, Crowley collected intelligence, tested psychological manipulation methods, and observed how perception could shape decisions and loyalty. Ultimately, Crowley's dual identity demonstrates the intersection of myth, perception, and power. The Great Beast was not just a rebellious figure. He was an operational strategy. His life provides historians with a case study in how belief, spectacle, and personal narrative can be weaponized. Through deception, Crowley achieved freedom to act, the ability to manipulate perception, and the capacity to influence political outcomes, all while the world remained convinced of his madness. When Aleister Crowley died in 1947, the story of his life became more mysterious than ever. Scholars and historians searching for confirmation of his alleged role in British intelligence discovered that key files had vanished. MI5 and MI6 repeatedly claimed that no records existed, leaving researchers to rely on fragmented mentions in American military archives, scattered correspondences, and testimony from diplomats and intelligence officers. The disappearance was precise, intense,